Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration, where today we're going to talk about alternative puzzle formats, or you can think of it as exploration content for your dungeon. Exploration is one of the three pillars of D&D, next to combat and social interaction. It covers a very wide range of activities, but basically those that can still have stakes, but aren't solved with words or blades. These are things like making knowledge checks, investigating an object in the room or a real prop you may have brought to the game, reading a journal you've written. But it also involves puzzles and traps. Now, I talked about physics puzzles all the way back in Season 1, Episode 3. Buttons, levers, pressure plates all make great content for your dungeon. Players have to learn to work together and coordinate their activities, while also exploring what that button does. In Season 8, Episode 6, Traps 2.0, we talked about what makes a trap interesting, what gives it stakes. But as you design more and more dungeons, create more content for your players, physics puzzles and traps lose their luster. And if not, you still want to challenge your players to something new. So in this episode, we're going to talk about some of that dungeon content. And anything I will call content in D&D means it must be interactive. A long, flowery, pre-written description is not content for your dungeon if it doesn't give your players something to do. It's also not sane to have the DM performing the entirety of the game session. A good puzzle gives you a break. You supply your players with all the information they need, and then get to sit back while they sort through it. One of the most obvious and perhaps easiest forms of puzzles is a riddle. And riddles are a lot like grenades. You throw them at your party and see if any players will jump on it. They can feel cheap in this way. Early on in your campaign, you can run a couple of trial riddles to see if your party even responds well to them, or if they find them frustrations. You might even have a seasoned riddler in your party who solves all riddles without any problems at all. Ideally, the riddle is interesting enough that the players interact with each other, having an in-character social interaction. But more often than not, one player knows the answer before another, and the riddle's solved. So we want to make them more dynamic. We want to make them interesting in some way. And the best way to do that is to make them interactive. Let's take, for example, a riddle you've probably heard before. Where can you find rivers without water? The answer is a map. Maps have pictures of rivers. By itself in a dungeon, the players say the word map aloud, the door opens. Not a terribly interactive moment. But if you had a table covered in objects, a book, a skull, a clock, a map, and that riddle on the wall led them to the correct object, now we're getting some content from this riddle. Tabletop games don't have UIs. They don't have drop-down menus. Connecting a riddle on the wall to an object-filled table is a puzzle when we're just using our imaginations. The map is a map they need to progress. They take the map and they're done. Or it could go deeper. The map says on it, what has hands but cannot clap? The clock. Looking under the clock, opening the little door to the pendulum for the clock, reveals the next step of the puzzle. But we could also prompt them in a different direction. After all, they just did words equal words. Let's add in numbers. 5 plus 6 equals 11. But below that you have written 6 plus 7 equals 1? Question mark? That too is a clock. 7 plus 6 equals 13. But a clock doesn't have a 13, it has a 12, and then a 1. In order to progress, it's not just the clock that's the answer. You have to set the clock to 1 o'clock. These riddles have become interactive. Now, there's nothing at all wrong with just doing a really simple riddle, particularly if it adds to the ambiance of your dungeon. If you had, for instance, Elvish sun worshippers, and you had in Elvish on the wall what flies about the temple and through its windows, but never touches it, the answer is the sun. But you're including a character's backstory, you're using one of their languages, in this case Elvish, and you tell the player that the Elvish word for sun is Anor. They say Anor aloud, the door opens. Not a complicated riddle, but gave a moment of flavor. And these Elvish sun worshippers are that much more real. And when they talk to the Elvish sun-worshipping ghost later on in the temple, that conversation in Elvish is that much more real. Simple riddles can be an opportunity for backstory, for character growth. If you have a talking doorway or a guardian, that gives the riddle, "Tell me what is given by a father, but lost to a daughter." The answer is a last name. Upon hearing their last name, it remarks, "Ah!" and tells them a little bit of their backstory, tells them of their family lineage. Well, now this is interactive, and it's a great excuse to unload backstory on players who wrote their backstory, but their character doesn't know their backstory. We've all had a few of those. If you find your players groaning at riddles, but it's a fun kind of groan, then you might want to make it a trait of one of your races or one of your types of temples. Maybe in your world, elementals always ask riddles. Maybe gnomes always pose riddles at their parties, or in taverns. And maybe one day when they encounter a dungeon of gnomish design, it's full of riddles, which is a nice little callback and a bit of lore for your world. Now, finding a good riddle or writing a good riddle can be very time-consuming. The easiest way to search for a riddle is to look them up by their answers. If you Google riddles eggs, you will find the riddle, what has to be broken before you can use it. There are also websites like Solve or Die, which allow you to look up riddles by their answer, and then change and theme the words to match your purposes. You could make them rhyme to make them seem more ancient and old. Or if you want to make them harder, you just fill the statements with fluff, or even hide the riddle inside of a paragraph. We're going to move off of riddles and talk about other puzzle formats, but always keep in mind what makes it interactive. The puzzle itself may be solved by a single player. What then does the group do together? Code puzzles are great at this sort of thing. A code is hidden in the surrounding area, and then the players have to bring the numbers or letters together to enter through a doorway to open a box, whatever it may be. The box or doorway presents the limitations. For instance, you could have a box with a combination lock on a desk. The combination lock answer has 3 numbers. On the table are 3 candlesticks. To the right of that, 2 inkwells. To the right of that, 4 cups. Now this takes advantage of the logic that we read left to right, and the players would enter the code 324 into the combination lock to open the box. This puzzle in a visual medium, like a video game or movie, would be way too simple. But because we're using players' imaginations here, and in a tabletop setting where anything could be the answer, we have to make things a little more obvious. There may be a chance that 3 candlesticks and 4 cups have been brought together, but 2 inkwells at a desk means something's off. It shows a puzzle is afoot. Now you could be more complicated the next time you did this puzzle, because the player is already in that headspace. This puzzle could be exponentially more complicated if it's in the very next room, because players still have that previous puzzle in their minds. This is the same sort of thing you might do for a code or a capitalization puzzle. Spread about a wine cellar are 4 signs: red wine, white wine, rose wine, and champagne. But amongst them are the capitalized letters R, O, C, and P. The answer to the doorway is going to be crop. But capitalizing the R in red wine, the C in champagne, even the P in champagne might not make it clear. And that's why we capitalize the O in rose wine. Something's off, and that off something creates the environment of a puzzle in our players' minds. Why is that O capitalized? It must be important. These off capitalizations is what you would have to include in a journal entry with a secret message based on the capital letters. Each sentence begins with a capital letter. The players may not put together that each letter at the start of each sentence forms a word, forms a sentence that they need to progress. But throwing in that mid-word capitalization that makes no sense gets their brains rolling. Another type of puzzle you might create is a translation puzzle, but this has a huge risk of being done by a single player because it's just not effective for a group to do together. This would be giving your players a code, a cipher, a way to decode a coded message. Numbers work decently well because players will team up. One does the actual translating, while the others match 1 to an A, 2 to a B, and so on. You could also use a font on your computer to create a cipher. Type out your message, change it to an exotic font, and then create a translation guide that the players find in the dungeon. Using the translator, they can head back to the words they don't understand. One font I enjoy using for this is called Drow Angular. The letter images are interesting enough that players can keep them in their minds while they move from cipher to the thing they're decoding. The real joy of a cipher or even a decoder ring is that you have it for a very long time and it keeps coming up. The players only have to translate short but important words, and pulling it back out of their inventory, out of a real or digital folder, gives them a little thrill as they realize the past and the present are connected. The final type of puzzle we're going to talk about are those big bomb puzzles, logic puzzles. They take a lot of setup, they take a lot of description, but once in the player's hands, it can keep them occupied for quite a while. All you need to do as DM is sit back and remind them of the information you've already presented. These are also known as brain teasers, but finding a good and useful one for D&D can be hard. A lot of the answers can be quite bogus. One of the most commonly used adventure puzzles is the honest and dishonest guard, also known as the twins, and goes by many other names. This is the room with 2 doors. One leads to safety, and one to certain death. In front of each door is a guard. One you're told always tells the truth, and the other guard always tells lies. You don't know which guard is which. You're allowed to ask a single question to determine which door is the correct door. This puzzle has been used in cartoons, movies, books across the board, and your players may already know the answer. The correct question to ask the guards is what the other would say. But this whole puzzle can be deconstructed into many different situations. One always tells the truth, one always lies is a great format to insert into a dungeon, and you can dress it up a number of ways. And this goes for a lot of different good logic puzzles, such as the Ravensborgs Guild puzzle. This puzzle has 5 statues, each with a name, and each statue says statements about the other. You're probably familiar with this kind of puzzle from schooling. For instance, the Simon statue says, one of the thieves is Kieran. The leader is a wizard. And Kieran's statue says, I am the leader. Rupert is a warrior. And so on. The various statues communicate informations. The players can lay it out on a piece of paper in a grid format as easiest. And they put together all the clues. And by process of elimination even, they know which statue's which. By properly labeling the statues, by figuring out one of the names of the statues, particularly that one that's process of elimination, so they have to solve the whole puzzle, the players can progress. Make up your own names for them. These can be very thick and hardy puzzles for a dungeon. You might also look up what's known as a grid puzzle. Again, you probably saw these in schooling. These are sometimes farms and you have to connect the animals to their vegetables, or children and you have to connect their ages to their favorite superheroes. They come with clues like, Brian likes Spider-Man, Tony doesn't like Superman, the youngest kid likes Spider-Man, and the kid who likes Superman is 8. By having all the names of the kids, the superheroes, and their ages, you can use those clues to lay out all the points on a grid and figure out who goes with what. Retheming one of these very simple puzzles for your dungeon takes a lot of concentration, but makes for a great environment for your players as they all spread about a room, looking for these clues and then bring them back together to solve the puzzle. The more you spread out the information, the more content you're going to create. For instance, if your players get information by looking at the words at the bottom of a statue, and you put that statue on the other side of a pit, now the players have to cross a pit to get that information. Instead of a pit, it could be a locked door. All these barriers to solving the initial puzzle can create more and more content, while still giving one dungeon an overall theme that is the initial puzzle. I'll include the names of these puzzles in the description of the episode. Creating puzzles is a time-intensive labor for your players, but I think you'll find it quite rewarding. If you found your own puzzles that work well for your players, let me know about them. Use the contact link over at kylefergusson.com or join the Discord and tell me about them there. I'd be happy to share other puzzle formats on the upcoming mailbag episode. But that is the end of this episode. Music was by Brian Griffith. You can support this show over at patreon.com/Kyle Fergusson. And I'll see you all next week with another episode of DM Gives Inspiration.